From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today we'll look ahead to the election for Wisconsin's state superintendent and learn more about the job. Then we'll learn about a strategy Milwaukee is using to capture stormwater and prevent flooding.
The biggest thing that we're increasingly challenged with in MMSD is managing the more frequent and more intense rainfalls.
Plus, we'll look at the documentary American Reckoning, which investigates the unsolved murder of a civil rights activist in Mississippi.
The civil rights movement is often a tale of a few iconic figures, but there were actually foot soldiers all over communities all over America, and especially in the South in the 60s. And this is one of those stories.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. But first, here are today's headlines. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. In a primary last week, voters weighed in on the candidates vying for our state's top job in K-12 education, the state superintendent of public instruction. Two candidates will face off in the general election on April 1st, education consultant Brittany Kinzer and incumbent state superintendent Jill Underly. But what does the state superintendent do? A variety of things, including tracking academic achievement and testing scores across the state, while managing and rating school district performance. Their department is responsible for licensing and training teachers, and also making sure state and federal dollars make it to your child's classroom. And their duties don't end there. WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel spoke with Dan Rossmiller, executive director of the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, about how the state superintendent impacts the education of students in the Badger State.
Let's start with the core functions of Wisconsin's state superintendent of the Department of Public Instruction. What are the main responsibilities of the state superintendent, and what are they allowed to do?
Well, Wisconsin has an elected state superintendent of public instruction, and that person is given supervisory authority over the public schools of the state. Wisconsin is unlike most other states. It does not have a state school board. So the state superintendent is essentially the person in charge of overseeing Wisconsin's K-12 public education system. Some of the duties include licensing teachers, overseeing the teacher preparation programs of the state, providing guidance and technical assistance to support public elementary and secondary education, distributing state and federal aids to local school districts, ensuring education for students with disabilities, and developing school and public library resources. More broadly, the state superintendent head is the administrative head of the Department of Public Instruction, which is the agency that carries out these functions under the direction of the state superintendent.
So in another system where the state superintendent, or the person who is overseeing education for the entire state, gets to focus a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of education, it sounds like Wisconsin's state superintendent does, at least to some extent, need to be politically aware or connected to work out some of these priorities and make sure that they end up in the final version of the budget. Is that fair to say? How do you see that, especially through your work with school boards?
If not partisan, there is a political role for the department. The department proposes a state education budget to the governor. That was done in, I believe, early November. And then the governor refines that, chooses what provisions to include and not include, or may choose different provisions. And then the budget that Governor Evers is going to introduce will have been shaped to some extent, sometimes more, sometimes less, by the proposed education budget the superintendent of public education and the department have put together.
The budget point is actually a great one, and I wanted to ask about that because there's then another step in the budget process, right? So how closely does the budget designed by the state superintendent usually resemble the final budget when it comes to education funding? There are a few more steps in that process, right?
Well, yeah. Sometimes it It does, and sometimes it doesn't. Of late, it has shaped some things, but certainly not all things. Right now in Wisconsin, we have a legislature controlled by a Republican majority in both houses and a Democratic governor. So to the extent that the priorities of the legislature and the governor differ, you'll see differences in the versions of the budgets that they offer.
How could Wisconsin State Superintendent protect public education in Wisconsin in the event of possible federal pressure? We're hearing a lot right now about dismantling of the federal Department of Education. Is that a role that this person needs to take on actively?
Well, we're talking about two different levels of government. The federal government is not influenced directly by the state superintendent of public instruction. That's why we have congressmen and women and senators. It's unclear what kind of changes we're going to see. The Department of Education was created by Congress. It can only be dissolved by Congress. There can be certainly decisions made by whoever heads that department on what they're going to prioritize and what they're not going to prioritize. I don't think that if the Congress makes dramatic cuts to federal aid to state education departments, that there's going to be much that the state superintendent of public instruction can do except complain loudly about it. I don't know exactly what the amounts are, but I think Wisconsin receives somewhere between $200 and $300 million in Title I funding, which is aimed primarily at lower income students and attempts to boost their school performance. And then Wisconsin also receives a significant amount of money for the education of students with disabilities through the IDEA program, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Those are probably the two biggest sources of money that come in. And the state is mandated to provide special education services to students with disabilities by both state and federal law. And if the federal government does not fund those obligations, I think that's going to create significant problems.
Let's talk a little bit about the differences between the state superintendent and the local superintendent. Can you explain the differences between those two offices and where parents should go with concerns?
Local superintendents are chosen by the school board of the district that hires them, and they serve on a 2-year contract, which may be extended with up to 2 1-year extensions. The state superintendent serves for a 4-year term, and there's a provision for the governor to appoint a new state superintendent if the state superintendent resigns or dies in office or whatever. At the local level, it's different. I don't believe there's a requirement that the state superintendent have a teaching license or an administrator license. Most of them do have that because the whole idea of the state superintendent, going back to the original part of the Constitution, was that they wanted someone who was educated in what worked and what didn't in schools, and someone that would be able to provide uniformity statewide. By contrast, the local district superintendent must have a teaching license. I don't know that there's actually a requirement that you have a district administrator or a superintendent at the local level, although almost everyone does. There are some ways that you can work around that. On a short-term basis, you need to have someone with an administrator license to accept certain federal monies and to sign off on certain grants and other things. But those people are evaluated by their local school board in the first year of their employment, and at least every third year after that. The state superintendent is evaluated by the voters, with a 4-year term. There are no term limits on the state superintendent. So we've only had 28 people serving in that office since the beginning of the state, since statehood in 1848.
It may be good to note here that one candidate for state superintendent, Brittany Kinser, does not have a teaching license and has not had a teaching certificate, although she previously held a school administrator certificate. So speaking to your comment there about what is required of a local superintendent as opposed to a state superintendent, that's important to note for listeners.
Yeah, the superintendent of a school district is authorized by statute to serve as a teacher or principal in their district.
We've even
So,
seen local superintendents step in and substitute teach in
yeah,
some districts around the country, right? So
yeah, that happens in some small districts. I know that the superintendent, if they have a commercial driver's license, sometimes been called in to drive a school bus.
drive the bus. The only other big difference is that the local superintendent can call a snow day. I don't think that the state superintendent does that for the whole state, right?
No, not to my knowledge, which is unusual because I remember a few years ago we had some really bitter cold, like, minus 30. And in Minnesota, the governor called off schools, and in Wisconsin, the governor does not have that ability. Neither does the state superintendent. We're a very strong local control state, for
Yeah.
better or worse. And much of what I do representing locally elected school boards is to try to preserve a space for locally elected boards to govern and to have a say in things.
Dan Rossmiller is the executive director of the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. He spoke with WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel.
This is Capital Notes from Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Maya Silver. Today we talk with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com, about the state Supreme Court race. Welcome, J.R. I have a quiz for you. Name one important position up for election this April.
Oh, well, there are several. State Supreme Court Justice, State Superintendent. There are several judicial races that are uncontested, so there aren't going to be really any contest there, but also Circuit Court, local offices, so there are a number of them. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of attention being paid to the election other than State Supreme Court and State Superintendent.
Right, okay. Well, I suppose we can get into a lot of those other races in southeastern Wisconsin going forward, but for today we're going to focus on the Supreme Court Justice race. Essentially, the state Supreme Court is comprised of 7 justices. They're elected to 10-year terms. The elections are statewide and technically nonpartisan, and it's happening this April. For the second time in a row, a seat is up for grabs that will either maintain or tip the partisan balance of those 7 justices. Tell us what's at stake, JR.
Ideological control of the state Supreme Court and the direction that court's going to take for at least the next year. Now, for conservatives, it's more serious than that. If you take the long-term view of the court, this is their last chance to flip the majority for a couple of years. In 2026, conservative Rebecca Bradley seat would be up. In 2027, conservative Annette Ziegler would be up. And then 2028, liberal Rebecca Dallett. So if conservatives don't win this race this year, they'd have to maintain 2 seats in back-to-back years just to have a shot in 2028 of flipping the court. That's a tough task. So for them, this is like really, really important. For liberals, it's important to maintain the majority, but they also have 2 more shots coming the next 2 years. They could flip it again, which would mean, yet again, a flood of spending in Supreme Court races in Wisconsin if that were to come to happen.
And getting into a little bit about why these 2 sides kind of want control of the court. Before the democratically backed candidate Janet Protasewicz was elected in 2023, that election tipped the balance to liberals. But before that, conservatives controlled the Wisconsin Supreme Court for 14 years. There were decisions that limited unions, affirmed a voter ID law, expanded gun rights, curbed the powers of the Democratic governor, banned absentee ballot drop boxes, and established political districts that ensured Republican dominance in the state legislature. How were the past 2 years, JR, different from that?
Oh, just 2 things that you mentioned that have flipped. So now drop boxes are again legal in Wisconsin. The Supreme Court last summer ruled that those were allowed. And then 2, they threw out the maps that had been in place previously, and that resulted in Republican lawmakers basically embracing the maps that Tony Evers drew for the Assembly and the Senate because they were fearful of what the court might draw. And when Democrats picked up 14 seats, 10 in the Assembly and 4 in the Senate last fall, it's changed the dynamic of the legislature dramatically. And those are just 2 things. We also have abortion cases for the court. powers of the governor, powers of the attorney general. I mean, the list goes on and on. We are in a very litigious capital right now. Basically, everything that happens ends up in court somehow or another because the governor is a Democrat, Republicans control the legislature, and they are at odds about all kinds of stuff. And so we've seen decisions like whether the legislature has final review of stewardship purchases. That was something the court took up this past. I mean, the court is hugely powerful and influential in how things operate in Wisconsin. And whoever wins, I mean, you don't want to just kind of say, well, if conservatives win, they'll always side with Republicans, and if the liberal wins, they'll always side with the Democrats. But it's kind of how it happens in Wisconsin right now.
You're tuned into Capitol Notes. I'm WEWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with J.R. Ross, editor of WisPolitics.com. Okay, so J.R., what do we know so far about the two candidates, GOP-backed judge and former Wisconsin Attorney General Brad Schimmel and Democratically backed Judge Susan Crawford?
Well, if you watch the TV ads, they're not very nice judges, I guess. I've started to be flippant about that, but that's what these races have become, right? If you are the opposition, you find any sentence they gave that was not the maximum, that involved a very not nice person, and you harp on that. I mean, Schimmel and his allies are hitting Crawford on sentences for child sex predators, those kinds of things. Crawford hitting Schimmel about sentences handed out to domestic abusers. We've all seen abortion be an issue in this case. That has been a dominant theme in the ads that Crawford and her allies have run against Schimmel. So it's really, the airways have really lit up already in this race in a unique way because, 2 years ago, we had a four-way primary in February that narrowed the field to two. So it was it started a little slower. This one, it became a full-blown general election in January, and any veneer of this being nonpartisan race was stripped away right away. I mean, Schimmel, obviously, former Republican elected official statewide. Crawford got $1 million, State Democratic Party, in December. The last reports we saw, she got another $2 million from the Democratic Party. Schimmel, $1.675 million from the Republican Party. You look to the people who are giving money to them or to the state parties that are funneling funds to the candidates. They're big-time GOP and Dem donors. This is a nationalized race because there are huge implications here. We are we are one of the swingiest of the swing states often. And things really kind of come down to Wisconsin at times. And there are huge stakes of who will set the rules and how elections are run in Wisconsin. And lately it's been the Supreme Court.
Both campaigns in their ads are trying to highlight the other's quote-unquote record of failures to keep Wisconsin safe. This is even though a vast majority of criminal cases do not reach the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and sentencing is something that happens at the trial court level. How does that play into how voters actually get mobilized, and what do you think they really need to know about what Supreme Court justices do?
Oh, it's part of the record, so it's fair game, and people will tell you that this resonates with people. If they see that somebody has bad judgment in their opinion, they will keep that in mind when it comes to the Supreme Court. So the court typically handles, big judicial theoretical cases, right? The big philosophies, how the law should be applied, not handing out sentences. But, people will tell you that these are part of their judgments, a record of how they handle things. And it plays in how voters view these judges. Granted, most voters aren't in tune with how the Supreme Court actually operates, but it's all part of the record that helps shape their view of these candidates.
You mentioned the nationalized nature of this election. Of course, 2023 really was, with the election of Janet Protasewicz running against Daniel Kelly, conservative. What are you watching at this point in the campaign, about 6 weeks for the election? Elon Musk has reportedly spent at least $1.5 million on commercials supporting Schimmel. What does the national interest in the race look like?
Oh, there's a lot. Musk has got $1.6 million in ads from what I've checked with Ad Impact. His group's put another $1 million into canvassing, which is get out the vote efforts. We've seen George Soros give $1 million to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. I mean, the list goes on and on of the people who have gotten involved nationally. And for Schimmel, that's a key thing in this race. 2 years ago, Daniel Kelly, the conservative, he declined to take direct transfers from the Republican Party. Remember, in Wisconsin, state law allows donors to make unlimited contributions to political parties, which can then make uncapped contributions to candidates. So 2 years ago, Janet Protasewicz got about roughly $10 million from the Democratic Party. huge help for her. Daniel Kelly declined to take transfers from the Republican Party, which still kind of baffles some people. Schimmel's not going to make that mistake. He has been unabashed saying he needs help, that he's looking for national groups to get in. He wants to make sure the playing field is level when it comes to the finances. And right now, actually, is tilted heavily in his favor. Looking at Impact, which tracks ad buys and independent expenditure reports, it was about 2-1 in overall spending, both what's happened and reserved in Schimmel's favor through the election. Now, that's a point in time that could shift, but there's been a huge influx of a conservative cash in this race. The question is, will Democrats match that or exceed it, and how are they going to spend the money going forward?
And let's talk about the abortion issue in particular. So that's the case about the 1849 law that a trial court judge ruled does not apply to abortions, but in fact outlaws feticide, which would be killing a pregnant person's baby without their consent. The trial court decision was appealed to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court has heard oral arguments. There's another case with Planned Parenthood. What are you watching for in that case and as it intersects with this election?
You know, I don't know that people are expecting anything to come down before the election. Kind of what I'm watching is, how does abortion play this spring as an issue, period? And, go back to last fall, and Democrats used abortion quite a bit in their campaign ads. It wasn't as effective as it had been in 2022 and the 2023 state Supreme Court race. Part of that was because voters were more concerned about the economy. That was the number one driving issue. You don't really have as much of an economic factor, though, in a judicial race. So what I'm wondering is, what's going to turn this race for voters? Is it the sentences that Crawford and Schimmel have handed out while they've been on the court? Is it abortion? Is it something else? What's going to drive this race? What's the issue that drives voters to the polls come April 1st?
And when we think about what's politically mobilizing for people in Wisconsin, I mean, we can't take it out of the context of the fact that there was the 2022 midterms, there was the 2023 state Supreme Court race, which was a big election in the state. We just had the 2024 election cycle. How is election fatigue playing into what you're seeing in terms of mobilizing voters this year?
Good question. Although turnout in the primary last week was about 9-10%, which actually was higher than in 2021. So I've marveled for years at Wisconsin voters. We've been the eye of the storm, it seems like, constantly for years and years, and they always answer the bell. When there's an election, they turn out. So my question is, at some point, are they going to say, I've had enough? It doesn't seem like it's going to be anytime soon. But, for Schimmel, he's trying to expand the electorate. When I started doing this 25 years ago, spring elections really tilted toward Republicans. It was an older, whiter, more conservative electorate turning out than compared to November. Well, things have shifted between the two parties. Now, the more reliable voters are the ones who turn out the most are Democrats. They're the more college educated, a little bit more suburban. All right, the rural blue collar voter is not as frequent, does turn out as frequently in low turnout elections. That's now the Trump voter. So for Schimmel, he wants to expand this electorate to make it look more like November of 24 and get more of Trump supporters out. The question is, how do you do that? Musk Group is trying to turn out voters right now as we speak. The state GOP is. Americans for Prosperity, they're making an effort, but we have not seen evidence yet that the Trump voter will turn out when Trump's not on the ballot. It just doesn't really happen as much. So that is definitely a challenge for Schimmel. For Crawford, she wants to recreate the coalition that Janet Prosewicz had. Get those suburban women who are concerned about abortion out, get college kids out who are concerned about that issue. It's going to be fast to see what the electorate looks like come April 1st and what drives them to the polls.
All right, well, thanks for the information and perspective on the court, JR, and thanks for joining me on Capitol Notes.
Anytime.
Did you know you can also listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. Coming up, we'll speak with two Milwaukee filmmakers about their recent documentary that looks into the unsolved death of a civil rights leader in the 1960s. But first, we'll visit a stormwater management project under construction in Milwaukee's 30th Street corridor. That's coming up next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Managing stormwater in our urban and rural areas is complicated, especially as the climate changes and winters get warmer and more erratic. Jerome Flogel is a senior project manager with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. The organization is midway into the construction of a massive basin to handle heavy rain events in the city's 30th Street corridor. The project is vital to surrounding neighborhoods, which suffered from devastating flooding, most recently in 2008 and 2010. For WUWM's Thin Ice series, exploring the impacts of warming winters, environmental reporter Susan Bentz met Flogel at the basin site on a very windy winter's day to learn more about the project.
Talk about what led to these projects, because this isn't the first basin in this corridor, but it's the biggest one.
It's the biggest one. This basin here will be 30 million gallons capacity when it's done. What you see basically the hole in the ground out here right now is about a third of the dirt that has to move here. So this basin is one of a series of 3 basins. It all is one solution to a problem, and the problem identified has been a chronic problem here, but it hit full force in 2010 with what I call kind of the biblical rain events that we had here in Milwaukee. The problem at that time was we just had this massive, very intense rainfall in July. 2 weeks later, all the ground's still saturated. The rivers and the waterways still haven't receded kind of the normal ground level, and we got another one of those huge rain events. So there was nowhere for water to go. So the flooding that impacted this area, this whole what we call North 30th Street corridor, was just hugely impacted by a lot of stormwater flooding. It wasn't Lincoln Creek coming out of the banks, because we've already kind of done that work. This area is the neck of a funnel of the city, about 3,000 acres, that drains all to this area right where we're standing, and it's trying to get to Lincoln Creek. It's trying to get the Milwaukee River and out to the lake. The problem is that we've massively, again, changed the landscape here. What we're standing on was all wetlands and tributary streams. All that water still wants to come through the same area, but in the industrial boom, we filled all of this. We filled the lowlands. We put the water where we wanted to put it. We put it all in pipes. The pipes were designed back through all this development 100 years ago for the best data that they had in the rainfall at the time. So now our challenge is to manage this water with all this change in the landscape. And then kind of the last 2 shoes to drop are, one is our infrastructure is aging, but the biggest thing that we're increasingly challenged with in MMSD is managing these intense rainfalls, the more frequent and more intense rainfalls. What we found is that when Lincoln Creek is full, to simplify this, I'll just say there's 5 buckets of water flowing down Lincoln Creek every second. What we found is there's a whole nother bucket out there trapped in the neighborhood that can't get there. So it's 20% of the water that kind of naturally wants to get to Lincoln Creek is stopped, again, by all of this infrastructure we've built in finite capacity. So that's where the basins come in, as it gives a place for that water to go until Lincoln Creek can go down and then flow out.
Do the 3 basins work together? In other words, as one fills, it goes to the next and the next when there is a huge storm, or do they each sort of work in concert but independently?
Yes and yes. So for the one solution to kind of solve this overwhelming flooding event in the large wet weather events that we have, they're all working together. They're pulling water off the system in 2 places, so all 3 basins need to be here to provide the capacity. It's just a matter of how big of a rain can we get and for water not to spill out into the neighborhood. Once the East Basin is full, then it's going to start flowing into the North Basin, which is the workhorse on that side of the railroad track. This basin here is going to start taking water off of a different point, the water that's coming out of the south to the west of here a little bit. And this one's going to start taking water on kind of when we get to that peak rainfall, when the system starts surcharging. The rainfall, we can't predict where it's going to fall. And that's part of the problem, is we get these pop-up showers in any part of the city, and it's how you manage that water where it ends up.
So the other 2, the companions, have been online
since 2018.
So there's been a lot of community inputs, pathways, and art, and what?
We've been trying to do right through design here, and we're continuing to work with partners to implement some of the things the community would like to see here. We have Clemens School just to the west of here a little bit. They're excited about kind of having an outdoor classroom here. But one of the big needs here that's expressed on the number, there's two. One we can build, which I'll get to, and the other one we can't. And it gets to be what we're going to do with all this dirt. So the one that we need partners for is a playground. Again, we want the site activated. We want people to be here and enjoy the green space because the majority of the time it's going to kind of look like this. It's going to be very peaceful. This is going to be a facility for water. It's going to be used maybe once every 5 years when we have the big rain event that the system can't handle. So we're working with some stakeholders and trying to basically solicit some funding to get that playground built. There's 3 daycares. There's 2 of them right across the street. There's 3 daycares in the area. Again, we have several schools. So the number one request they had is, can we have a place and a playground for the kids to go to? So I think we're pretty well on the track of hopefully being able to envision that. The one that we can build, because we got a lot of soil here yet to manage, and every truckload we don't have to haul off of the site is a truckload that's going to save us some money. So there will be what we're going to call the North Soil Management Area, which is kind of where we're standing. And what I'll just say is that'll be free and open for kids to come out here in the wintertime. If they want to sled, they're going to have a really nice hill to sled on. So,
Speaking of snow and winter and changing climate, how much have the designs of these basins, of the work that you're doing, how much can you factor in the changing climate?
So the kind of going back to what I kind of described, the pipes and infrastructure that we're trying to make this water behave in right now, most of this was built and designed, at the latest, probably the newest infrastructure out here is probably in the 30s and 40s,
Wow.
and everything else predates that.
Sure.
So there's been a lot learned about design since then. Number 2, there's been one of the biggest things incorporated into the design of these 3 basins is there was a major update in the NOAA rainfall data on how we look at that data. There was about a 10 to 20% increase in capacity that we added to these basins after we went back and looked at that new rainfall model. But also looking again at how we're getting rainfall patterns now compared to 20, 30, or 50 years ago. Almost a 20% increase in the capacity we added to this. The second thing we did, it's really hard to believe if you look at the pictures out here in 2010, where all the water was spilled out. I mean, 35th Street, 27th Street, you look at them, there's no hills. It's not like it's in a low area here, but there was a foot of water run down these streets because it was just, again, spilling out everywhere out of every manhole. So when the basins are done, our criteria was that on a 100-year level of service, there would be no impact to any buildings. So, we mapped out the buildings, looked at the lower areas. There'll be 0 impact to any buildings. There'll be a maximum of a 6-inch impact to any street at the lowest spot for a maximum of 2 hours. And then with that, we added another foot from where we anticipate the high water level will be to where the top of the basin is. Now we got an extra what we call freeboard. And then we added another foot before it would, a worst case scenario, spill out, go over that other foot again, and then impact any of those things that I talked about. Spill into a property, spill into a street. So when we're still working on this design, when we were done with the North and East Basin, and we kind of ran the model to try to break it, we were at almost a 200-year event before we started to get worried about, violating kind of one of those objectives. Mm-hmm. And that's unprecedented as far as a stormwater facility that the district builds. We're trying to capture that water before it gets to the waterway and causes problems. So that was kind of the last criteria, was whatever we built here could not negatively impact Lincoln Creeks. So that's all the steps that we've tried to do to look ahead, not only to make this serve to our best of our ability right now to design this facility to service now to meet those objectives, but give us some capacity in the future for again, deteriorating infrastructure upstream of us, but also not be able to predict the future on where the rainfall patterns will go, but all indications will be that they'll again get more frequent and more intense.
Back to winter, decades ago when winters were more predictable, yet very cold weather, we were tended to have a fair amount of snow, things were, frozen up, and then you'd have a gradual thaw. And that is very, you know, sporadic now. So how does that factor into your world, whether it's here at this basin or the work that MMSD does?
Yeah, I think, on a larger scale, that's part of the challenge we have, particularly parked right next to a great lake, is the warming winters, the changing weather patterns is, the lake is not all covered with ice, for months
Sure.
on end. It's open, and when it's open, it's evaporating, and it's changing the rainfall patterns. So that definitely is contributing to the rainfall patterns we have. We used to have kind of a break in the winter time. And that's big for us because number one, we don't have to worry about these flooding events in the winter, but also it was downtime for us to do maintenance in our facilities that we need during the heavy rain events, which we typically would expect in the spring and summer. That window is getting very narrow for us if it's there at all. And that's, again, our big infrastructure, things that we do at the plant, that hamper our capacity for water reclamation at the plants. That window's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So really at this, even now today, we have to be prepared to manage stormwater pretty much 12 months out of the year because we can get an event, like we've seen the last, let's say, month where we have these swings in temperature and it gets to 50 degrees and we have an inch of rain. We got to be ready to manage that not only in the sanitary but in the storm. And then it just makes it worse if we've gone through a cold period and we have frozen ground and we have zero permeability pretty much, and it's all going to be runoff.
Jerome Flogel is a senior project manager with the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. He spoke with WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bentz. A new season of Bubbler Talk is underway, and we need some new questions. Submit your questions about the Milwaukee area at WUWM.com. A PBS documentary investigates the unsolved murder of a civil rights activist. We'll learn more next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. In 1967, Warless Jackson Sr. was killed by a bomb planted in his truck. Jackson was an NAACP leader in Natchez, Mississippi, a town known for Ku Klux Klan activity. His murder remains unsolved, and a documentary called American Reckoning explores how the events surrounding his death unfolded. Filmmakers Brad Lichtenstein and Yoruba Richin use rare archival footage from the 1960s to highlight the civil rights movement and black resistance in Natchez. They both joined Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski to share more about American Reckoning.
Brad and Yoruba, welcome back to Lake Effect. Great to speak with you both again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us back.
So to start, why Natchez, Mississippi?
Well, this is a project that actually dates back to 2014. And brief little backstory, Congressman John Lewis had a lot to do with why we made this film. I had met him and first started what became a lifelong friendship when I was 15 years old, working for his first congressional campaign that was successful when he was elected back in 1985, 1986. And cut to many years later, I was in his office. We were talking about some different projects. And his press secretary was with us, Brenda Jones. And she pointed me in the direction of the cases that were to be re-examined by the Emmett Till Act, which Congressman Lewis authored and which was passed in 2008. And then once he pointed me in that direction, and I started looking at the different people who were included on that list of cases, over 150, I saw that there were some in Natchez, Mississippi, and that there was this film, Black Natchez, that had been made during that time. And then a few phone calls after that discovered that there was all of this footage that had been shot and not used in the film, but they were outtakes, and that they actually included a lot of the story of Worlis Jackson Sr. So that's kind of how we landed in Natchez and in the story of Worlis Jackson.
Yoruba, could you share a little more about this rare archival footage and how you and Brad came together to be on this project?
Yeah, so Brad and we met at a ITVS confab back in 2012 and then stayed in touch through the years. In 2016, we were both at Sundance, and we ran into each other, and we, as you're wont to do at Sundance, talked about projects we were pitching and projects we were working on and developing and trying to fundraise for. And Brad told me about American Reckoning. And I was immediately intrigued because of the story. And then he sent me the first trailer that he did, which was so powerful. And I saw this incredible archive footage that I'd never seen before. And that told the story of what was happening in Natchez at the time, which the story I did not know in terms of the civil rights struggle there. And then when I delved deeper and found out that the Deacons for Defense and Justice were part of this story, it really sealed the deal for me, because I had heard of the Deacons and knew a little bit about them, became kind of obsessed because they'd been so erased from our history, and that their story was part of the American Reckoning story was really exciting to me. And that's how I came to be involved in the project. And then, and here we are.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the Deacons for Defense and Justice, their story is often excluded and written out, and I'm sure, especially for many white audiences, this might be the first time they're even becoming aware of such a group, and it's really the black resistance to the white terrorism happening, and especially in Mississippi. Can you share a little more about the boycott of downtown Natchez? Because I feel like often in the American civil rights movement, it's centered or reduced to simply Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolent movement. But what was the strategy for the Deacons of Defense and Justice?
The boycott that you mentioned is a big piece of the story that we tell in American Reckoning, central to the efforts that were going on with the NAACP, which Worlis Jackson was the treasurer for. And Charles Evers, Medgar Evers' brother, was the secretary for the entire state, and he was in Natchez. Central to their strategy to be able to get demands met, and demands about access to education, access to public amenities, putting Black police officers onto the force, things like that, was a boycott. And a boycott was necessary because the white power structure wasn't yielding in Natchez. And, I should point out that the civil rights movement is often a tale of a few iconic figures, but there were actually foot soldiers all over communities all over America, and especially in the South in the 60s. And this is one of those stories. The boycott is something that was so important because it's what changed the outcome of things. And the Deacons, while they were not the organizers of the boycott, they helped to enforce the boycott. And I'll pass it to Yoruba to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's something that I found so fascinating in making the film, that not only were the Deacons defending the community against white terrorism and Klan violence, they had to enforce the boycott. You have to make sure people aren't breaking it. And, Charles Ever has this line, he says, we have a right to discipline our own people. Sometimes this stuff isn't pretty in terms of how you make change. But they made sure that Black people did not break the boycott. And the white business structure, power structure, crumbled in a very short time period. And it's because of that strict discipline around the boycott that changes were made. And they became a model for other boycotts around Mississippi.
Brad, you mentioned this name, and we'll circle it back here. One key component of your film is the Jackson family. Their father, Worlis Jackson Sr., was the treasurer of the local NAACP branch and the target of a second bombing in the same community in 1967. So how did you both come to know and be trusted by the Jackson family to help share their story?
Well, of course, every documentary involves a deep level of trust, and that's something that's earned over a period of time. When I first met Werlist, this was before Yoruba was involved in the project, I went down to Natchez, and really the only appointment I had was with Stanley Nelson, who's an investigative reporter that you meet in our film too, because he investigated the murderers. He investigated the Silver Dollar Group, a subset of the Klan that not only was responsible for Werlist Jackson's murder, but for others as well. And, when I met Werlist Jr., I just said what I was interested in doing and suggested that if he was interested in talking more about it, just to come meet me at a park. And I went and hung out at this park because I guess I felt like it was really important that with something like this, give him the space to reflect and think about it. This is a conversation he wants to continue. And he did come, thankfully, to the park later that day. And one of the first things we did was just drive around Natchez. I just asked him to share with me, his version, what does Natchez look like to him? And then I met his sister, I met Denise. And from there, we just grew a relationship. Eventually, when Yoruba came on board, she got to know them as well. And, now we're all in this together.
Yoruba, what struck you about the Jackson family?
Yeah, I mean, it was first off, it's such a responsibility to be entrusted with stories that you're telling, any story that you're telling. So, and especially this one that is so painful, so traumatic for the family. And so they were so generous with sharing their stories and giving us access to their emotions, to, what images they had, documents that they had. And I'm so happy that we finally got to do it, because it took a minute. But part of the healing process, I think, is telling the story. I mean, that's what Denise has said, getting the story out there and honoring her father and the sacrifice that he's sacrificed his life for change. The other thing that struck me is how Werlist really tried to protect his children from the violence that was going on. They didn't talk about it a lot. They didn't talk about what he was doing. And this is in many Black families because it's dangerous to talk about this stuff. It just was so striking to me that, that he kept this part of his life his own. He knew the danger, and he was trying to protect his family.
Well, and the fact that it was only one generation removed, and the Emmett Till legislation trying to bring justice to some of these families, and in the case of the Jackson family, there still aren't official answers. But what do you think your film offers to not just this family story, but this event and the many similar events like it?
I think it offers again, lifting up these foot soldiers of the movement who we don't hear about. And so lifting up, Werlist Jackson. And it also begs the question of what is justice? Since we are not going to the family's not going to get, someone in jail for this. They're all dead, the people who did this. It forces us to ask the question, what is justice? And have a question about reparations. I mean, these were families that were hurt, were traumatized, and reparations is about repair, right? And this and so many other stories is an example of where, we really need to discuss what reparations would be and what do they want for reparations. Some may want money, some may want services, some may want an honor, a museum built in their honor. I mean, there are many different ways that reparations should be understood. And I think that this film, we end with that. We leave with that.
Yoruba Richin and Brad Lichtenstein are the co-directors and co-producers of American Reckoning. They spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski in 2022. You can watch the documentary anytime online on PBS Frontline. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll hear from people in Milwaukee who are supporting Black and brown mothers through and after pregnancy. That's tomorrow at noon, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.